As Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visits Washington, some doubt the purpose of his trip. At home in Israel and in the US, critics say Netanyahu has not done enough to free the hostages held by Hamas since the 7th of October.
Since Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Joe Biden last saw each other in September, ties between their two countries have only become more tense. And when the Israeli leader makes a speech to the U.S. Congress on Wednesday, experts say he hopes his message would convince more than just the gathered lawmakers.
He has two audiences in mind. One is the American audience, and he wants to build support for Israel in Congress, reinforce Israeli-U.S. ties. He's also thinking about a domestic audience. So many Israelis are upset with how the war has gone. They're upset about the hostages. I think he wants to demonstrate that he hasn't destroyed U.S.-Israeli relations, as some of his political critics argue. What he is much less interested in is what the Biden White House thinks.
Concerns over Israel's Rafah offensive in May prompted the U.S. to stop certain arms shipments to Israel. And a video Netanyahu released claiming that the White House was withholding even more support than it had made public put further strain on the relationship. But that the Israeli leader has also yet to express full support for a U.S.-backed ceasefire hostage deal, essentially blocking a path to peace. That's especially troubling to Washington.
He will humiliate Biden, frankly, by showing up without having agreed to a ceasefire deal. I think the anticipation was that by the end of July, with this war in its 9th month, that there would have been a ceasefire, that there would be a plan for what happens afterwards. This is not the right time. If he had accepted a ceasefire months ago and begun a reconstruction process in Gaza, perhaps.
At home, the Israeli opposition also called for Netanyahu to either announce his acceptance of the hostage deal in front of Congress or not go to Washington at all. But Maya Roman, whose relative is still being held by Hamas in Gaza, says she'll be going to the U.S. Capitol to try to keep the spotlight on the remaining hostages rather than on politics.
There are hostage families that are coming with him, and he's going to talk about the ordeal we've been through. And all of those things are true and important for people to remember. I just feel like if he talks about those things without being committed to a deal, then he's doing a disservice. He's basically taking our pain and using it for gain and not for our purposes, not for bringing back our loved ones.
Maya Roman will be in Congress to watch Netanyahu. But more than a dozen Democrat lawmakers say they'll show their opposition to Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza by staying away.
And let's get more on this from DW correspondent Tania Krämer in Jerusalem. Tania, with a hostage deal still hanging in the balance and criticism back home, what message will Netanyahu be bringing to the U.S. Congress?
Well, I think the sense in Israel that his visit in Washington has become just much more complicated for Netanyahu because of the withdrawal of President Joe Biden from the presidential race. And Netanyahu has to walk a very fine line here, also because this visit comes as a very low point between the U.S. and Israeli relations. Now, it is not clear when the meeting that's very much looked at here, aside from the speech in Congress on Wednesday, there was supposed to be a meeting between Joe Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House because of Biden's COVID-19 infection. It's not yet clear when this will be scheduled, but it will be very interesting to see the dynamic between the two leaders. Their relationship has been strained, although we have to say the U.S. support for the war in Gaza has been very strong with continuous arms supplies to Israel. But both leaders have not seen eye to eye in many decisions. And it's talked about here that Joe Biden, now that he dropped out of the race, could also think about his legacy and could put or assert more pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, on the other hand, we also understand Netanyahu will also look to mend ties with presidential candidate Donald Trump. There has been a close relationship between the two while Trump was president, but this relationship has also suffered. But as you say, hanging over all of this is the question of the hostages that remain in Gaza. And there's a sense here in Israel, at least in the media, but also people talking about it, that Benjamin Netanyahu is out of touch with the public sentiment. A majority of the public wants to see the hostages to come home, although maybe not everybody's happy with such a deal. But that's a deal that also was put forward by Joe Biden, and it hasn't really closed yet. And there will be also protests, we understand, that are expected by relatives and families of the hostages that travel to Washington separately that will protest against Netanyahu there in Washington.
Briefly, Tania, this visit comes as the war continues to rage in Gaza. What is the latest there?
Well, that's right. We're hearing there from residents, especially in Khan Yunis, but also other parts of Gaza, especially also in Gaza City. There is an intense bombardment going on, and that also comes especially there in Khan Yunis after the Israeli army on Monday ordered people to evacuate once again from certain areas in the east of Khan Yunis, but also reportedly part of the so-called humanitarian zone that they said in that statement they would rearrange. So you can imagine that people are again on the move and not knowing where to go, and casualties are reported from there and also from other parts of Gaza.
Tania Krämer in Jerusalem, thanks so much. And as we just heard, the plight of civilian Palestinians trying to find refuge in Gaza is ongoing as Israel's offensive continues, even into areas formerly declared safe.
Once again, hundreds of people forced to evacuate. This time, the Israeli military ordered Gazans to leave an area it had designated a humanitarian zone. They took what they could carry and hurried to escape.
We were making breakfast for our children as we had been safe for a month, only to be stunned by shells, warning leaflets and martyrs in the streets. We went out in panic. You could see what people looked like. Look at the crowd. We're being displaced for the 15th time.
Israel began shelling and airstrikes in Khan Yunis after ordering evacuations. It said these areas had been used for renewed attacks by militants. The Hamas-run health ministry reported at least 70 people had been killed and more than 200 wounded.
All of a sudden, the fighter jet struck and houses were targeted. I was left passed out on the ground.
Gaza's overwhelmed hospitals received a large number of casualties on Monday. Some were unable to operate because of the new offensive.
The situation is very difficult inside the hospital because there is no spaces for the patients. There is no space in the operation theaters. There is lack of medical supplies, so we cannot survive our patients. We cannot survive our severely injured patients. The situation became more and more difficult, more and more critical.
The United Nations and international relief agencies insist there is no safe place left in Gaza. But these families have no other option. Once again, they have to move to get away from the next Israeli strike.